Hi, it's in the afternoon of about 3 o'clock on the 5th of June. I've spent the last several nights watching the so-called riots, marches, protests, or whatever in the hell anybody wants to call them. And I'm just really amazed at the different type of coverage and the slant that various stations are putting on the protests. And it bewilders me, actually, how irresponsible and shallow the press is. We have some of the press calling the protesters radicals, vandals, criminals, etc. We also have references to anarchists, we have references to anti-fa, and all kinds of things. One of the things I learned early in representing many protesters from the 60s on was, first off, the important thing, if you're watching or if you're participating as an observer or whatever, you have to learn to differentiate things. And secondly, you have to be prepared to explain journalistic bias on both sides. For instance, some of the accounts state that the protesters were protesting because of equal rights, and it was mainly black people protesting, and then they said, well, a lot of white people came in with the protest and they're protesting for equal rights and things like that. That's actually bullshit. What they're protesting, really underlying, is a police state that's emerging, and they don't like to see the police state. But most of the protesters are a little too unsophisticated to understand that. Also, the majority narrative wants to place this confrontation and this conflict in terms of black and white in racial issues. That's really misleading. It's not a matter of race. It's a matter of economics. It's a matter of have and have-nots. And the have-nots are tired of being oppressed by the richer or more privileged or better off. My personal belief is that as long as Martin Luther King was talking about black versus white and the whole civil rights thing and equal rights for both parties, as long as it divided the whites and blacks, he was allowed to live. But when he started talking about unions and talking about economic disparities, they got suspicious. And when he came out with a speech saying we ought to have black and white together during the garbage strike in Tennessee, then the white establishment had to stop it. They don't want black and white together looking at economics. They want black and white separate and fighting between themselves so that they can exploit all of us and rob all of us in a systematic way that they've been doing for centuries. I started out my political career under Lyndon Johnson with his vision of the Great Society. There was a lot of protests then. There was anti-war protests, civil rights protests, and all kinds of causes that were being advanced, and some with violence and some without violence. But it was viewed sort of as an economic thing as much as a racial thing. And it was also a matter of curtailing government power. Could the government force people to fight a foreign enemy on foreign soil without a declaration of war? Could a president, as commander-in-chief, say, okay, let's go over and fight the gooks in Vietnam and take over what's there? They staged a propaganda campaign and painted anybody that questioned their authority as communists or reds or radicals, revolutionaries, whatever. And what they did was successfully close down debate. But they didn't close it down that much. And many of us kept at it and kept protesting and kept going and going and going until people became more informed and more enlightened. And the more that happened, the less power the government had to pit people against each other. I started an amendment back there to the state constitution, providing that no citizen of Colorado could be drafted for an undeclared war. And I think the constitutional basis was sound. If you want Coloradoans to go fight in a foreign war under the auspices of the United States government, then the Constitution says Congress shall declare war. If Congress declares war, then the executive can, as a commander-in-chief, execute congressional demand. The president just can't take it upon himself to order an invasion or order this, that, or the other. Now, in the 60s, it was somewhat murky because at that time you had special operations forces and things like this. A lot of the activity was a cover-up for criminal activities because the United States government and the security services, like the CIA, wanted to take over the opium trade from the French intelligence services and expected that whole thing to fall with Dien Bien Phu. So I had clients, for instance, that were worked for the government that were there prior to the fall of Dien Bien Phu. And they were involved in the opium trade. It's an open secret and no surprise to many that a government airline named Air America was ferrying all the opium and things like that all over Southeast Asia. The radicals, or people not liking the CIA control of the drug trade, they were branded as radicals, revolutionaries, communists, etc. And they were eliminated. Generally not with incarceration, but with an ultimate solution. And this was part of a thing called the Phoenix Program. The Phoenix Program was run by a general who lives in Colorado, and his second in command was another Coloradoan that edits a magazine and recruited mercenaries here. He and I were in school together, and he ran a recruiting office on Larimer Street in the 60s. But the main point of what I'm trying to say is there were studies done by some of my colleagues at the university, for instance, that proved or showed that protests were quiet until the police came, and the police were sort of agents provocateurs. Now, all the protesters that I've represented in my career, including Mexican Americans, Mexican nationalists, Black Panthers, anti-war activists, socialists, union representatives, etc., pretty much all adhered to the nonviolent approach because violence interfered with the cause. It brought about bad publicity and challenged the credibility of any kind of a movement. So one of the things that we all did that were working in this area was we took training and then trained others to look for agents provocateurs. And I can state categorically that every demonstration that I represented people from had agents provocateurs in it. The biggest one was one that was supposedly planned at the Republican convention in Florida when Nixon was going to get nominated, where there was a group that I represented called Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and it was exposed that the whole group of agents provocateurs wanted to get the veterans armed with bows and arrows and attack people at the convention, showing that they were insurrectionists, etc. The government has to have the majority of the people and the press believe that people are happy and ignorant and they're in charge and we like them in charge. And anybody that doesn't like the government in charge and like government repression or overreaction, etc., has to be a communist or a reaction or some sort of left-wing rebel, insurgent or whatever. Now, until Nixon, you didn't have any training for insurgency. You had a lot of toleration for free speech, the right to assemble, etc. Most people recognized that the Vietnam War was controversial, and various people could disagree. The narrative was whether or not you were patriotic, and they tried to say that if you supported the war, or what turned out to be unbridled capitalism, you were patriotic. If you gave your life for that, you were patriotic. If you questioned the authority of the government, which at that time was pretty much funded by multinational corporations or American corporations and well-paid lobbyists, then you were unpatriotic if you didn't acquiesce to their line. Now that didn't work until a long time after Nixon, and when Nixon tumbled down due to the Rhea case and the Watergate burglaries, it was set back for a while. And then we had investigations on what caused the unrest and what caused the violence. It was called the Kerry Committee report. And the Kerry report found unequivocally that protests were peaceful until police arrived. And you got to think about this. You're a young protester and you're seeking justice. You believe in the Constitution. You believe in the government. You believe in fairness. And you think that some of the leaders are just misguided. You can't believe they're corrupt and only out for the almighty dollar, and that they really got to believe in our democratic form of government. That being the case, you go out and say, look, why don't you guys consider this? The other is unjust. We believe that all people should be equal. We believe there should be no discrimination against black people. Now, that makes a lot of people nervous, and the ones in power particularly.
Hello.
So they go out and they say, knock these young bastards around. Break a few skulls. Get them in line. We don't want them saying things like this. We don't want them believing things like this. We want them to go in lockstep so that when we, as the barons of industry, tell them to go fight our wars, they'll go out there and fight. And this has sort of been the status quo for several decades, at least while I've been involved in various political movements. The next thing I want to address in my next speech is what happened during trials with the American Indian movement, particularly in Minneapolis. It might shed some light on what is going on now by looking at what went on back then. That's all for today. You guys have a good day. Have fun. Stay well. Stay isolated, but not inactive.